Hello, hi everybody. This is John Tierney, and I've got a wee slideshow here to follow on from a talk that we wrote and presented on Monday night as part of Heritage Week on the 18th of August. On Monday night, I covered a very broad brushstrokes element of our approach to using historic gravestones as a data set for tracing historic families of parishes. And in this video, I want to show a bit more detail in relation to Ardmore. Aidan had advised me earlier how to connect to the big screen in the room, but I obviously got it wrong. So I went kind of off script for a lot of the talk, whereas now I want to go back and show some of the work that myself and Martha have been working on. So since 2010, we've been working with communities all over Ireland to do community graveyard surveys, and we publish them online to historicgraves.com, the web platform that we run. We've worked with well over 600 community groups and have published nearly 1,000 graveyards online, and they're all freely available. And Ardmore is our home parish. It's where we test the technologies that we use elsewhere, and also then it's where we pursue ideas that we've gleaned from elsewhere, from working with people in communities outside of Ardmore, and it's a kind of a cross fertilization of ideas. So we are working with communities all the time, and pretty much I'd say 90% of all the surveys we've done have been community surveys. For us, the project started as a field archaeology survey. That's what we do. That's our training, and we wanted to record gravestones, but quite quickly we realised we had it wrong. We weren't recording gravestones. We were recording communities, family groups. The gravestones were just an element or a means of actually getting access into the families and the family histories. And the reason the project took off from an early stage is that most of the work is done by volunteers. There isn't the funding there for us to go and do this with a whole lot of teams, professionally trained people. So we depend on the efforts, the permission of local authorities and the efforts of local communities. And what drives those local communities are things like pride of place, but then especially the desire to know what is carved on their family headstones. They might find it hard to read them, whereas we can help them in doing that. And as most historic headstones in Ireland are later than 1720, then we kind of see them as being very good for working out the social history of a parish from 1720, 1780 onwards. But we've come in recent years to realise actually you can get us back further than that. I won't go into this slide too well. If you want to read it, you can click on pause and then you can read that. But the key thing is that we're now thinking that if we can get headstones from the 1700s, that's showing us potentially strong families of that period, and then potentially allows us to project backwards from that early modern period into the late medieval. And that's tied in with Munster plantation, the Ulster plantation, elsewhere, other plantations, and that major shift that went from where the landlords were the Gaelic aristocracy, the Gaelic lordship, to being the Protestant ascendancy. And that all that turmoil happened from, let's say, the 1580s, let's say just to the 1680s. And for me as an archaeologist, I'm always loath to actually jump on, say, oh, it was genocide and it was slaughter and it was all that kind of carry on. I just didn't have the training for that. But now I note that the historians are publishing and are satisfied to now finally say that, yeah, Tudor warfare in Ireland, which was an expression of European warfare, had genocidal elements in it. And also into Cromwell's time. I know some people say, oh, sure, we all know Cromwell, it was genocide, but I think if you're working on scientific facts, you need to actually take a cautious approach and you need to actually work on the facts. And now the historians are saying, yeah, we're seeing genocide there, all right. So the populations, the families that we're studying in Ardmore, some of them, many of them, we think survived the trauma of the 1580s onwards. By the 1590s, we all know Walter Raleigh has got some kind of association with Ardmore, but mostly it's the Earl of Cork, Richard Boyle, an amazing character and a guy who really nailed down the Munster plantation from West Waterford all the way to West Cork. up north into County Limerick and everything like that. An amazing character based out of Youghal, and had a major geopolitical influence in our country. And he definitely had a big impact in Ardmore. Um, uh, he, he was, I wouldn't say he was unusual but he was those type of colonizer who actually reinvested the money that he was making out of the land back into the land. He put money into infrastructure, into bridges, roads, into industry, and so on. So kind of a good guy, bad guy kind of a thing, all on his own. But his influence, if we trace recent work on him, you'll see that his fingerprints are all over Ardmore, and that the shift that went from the early monastic site into a medieval site, into a medieval place with the manor of Ardmore, the major change then was when he and his cohort took over in the late 1590s and into the early 1600s. So keep all that in mind when we're looking at the families of Ardmore. In total, in the graveyard, in the last few years, we have recorded every gravestone inside in the new ground and the old ground. This map here shows the old ground, 5th century onwards, and we have recorded 467 inscribed gravestones, 296 in the old ground, and about 171 in the new ground. I won't go into too much detail on the burial practices, that's a talk for another day, but the main burial density is south of the cathedral. And as is the norm in Irish graveyards, most of the burials will be south of the ruined church, or in this case, a cathedral. Number two, there's a dense group of late 18th and early 19th century burials around the saints' graves. So the Banachon is over there. You see where it says the old ground, 5th century onwards, at the tip of that letterbox there, text box, that's the Banachon. And there's a very tight group in there. In the Catholic faith, the closer you are to the altar, the easier your transition into heaven. Or if there's a saint's grave, the closer you are to the saint's grave, then it will assist your ascension into heaven. So all those families, the hypothesis we have is that those families who are buried around the saint's grave are going to be our middling to high status Catholic families of those late 1700s and early 1800s. And I'm going to look at that later on and see, can that show us who these particular families were? And no surprise, we'll recognise a lot of the surnames. The spellings will be in older form, but the actual surnames will be some of the main families who are still in Ardmore here today. Another group we have noted is inside in the nave of the church, of the cathedral, the largest part of the ruin there. That finally, when the cathedral went out of use, that became a little private burial ground, mostly for Protestant families. Then at the eastern end there where the church is, that was the earliest 9th century stone church, and then it continued in use as a church all the way up until the 1830s when St. Paul's took over. So the Church of Ireland families continued to observe Mass inside in that part of the church all the way into the 19th century. And the burials down in the nave then represent those particular families, or some of them anyway. Then the new ground officially opened as a cemetery from 1913 onwards, but we have evidence that the actual burials were taking place in the new ground in advance of 1913. There's, I think there's there's a Roach headstone there from 1906, and there's a Kennedy headstone from around 1897. So I think that's not uncommon that burial would advance before the officials caught up with it. So the survey work has been done by myself, by our colleague Jacinta Kiley, Martha Hannon and Juliana Tierney, and all these names are now are all written on record sheets. And this is what the record sheets look like in the office. It's 5 folders, 100 sheets each, and handwritten record sheets inside of all those. They've been typed up by Juliana and a bit of technology, and this is what they look like. So, for instance, in the spreadsheet, if we were to search for a particular family name, then it'll hop out for us. In this case, so we've searched for the Keane surname, which would be one of the bigger and longest running families in the parish. So in time, in a couple of weeks, what we're asking for our community members to help us is to identify the townlands for every headstone. So we haven't got that. We have about townlands for just over half of all the headstones that are in the graveyard, and we are now asking for assistance to that. Once we've got that information in, we'll upload the full data set into Historic Graves into the website. This is a map of the new ground, and it dates to 1913, and it shows the new ground divided into sections A, B, and C. So that's the top part of the website there, of the graveyard, the cemetery there. And this is a close-up then. The new ground is essentially a cemetery added on to the old ground, which was essentially a graveyard. The grave spaces in the new ground, there are slightly different dimensions are shown on the cemetery map, but the average grave space is about 4.5 foot by 7 foot. And it's got a very broad range. It's got top end Church of Ireland mortuary monuments. It's got your ordinary uninscribed grave. This one here on the left, a little grave hump, and an unmarked stone marking the head of the grave. And sometimes the grave humps also have a footstone at the bottom. The gravestone there on the right, it's a limestone, late 19th century. 1895, 1897, and it's for the Kennedy family. So, it's easy to say there, look, like if there's a headstone with Kennedy on it and it's from 1895, then all we got to do is go back and trace earlier Kennedy headstones to see how long the Kennedys have been here. I was actually interested after the talk on Monday night. I went into the bar to get a drink, and who was serving me but one of the Kennedy lads. So it's living culture really, and the stones kind of represent those different generations. If we want to go back, some of the photographs I'm about to show next are done from a Community Monument Fund project we did during lockdown in 2021. Dr. John Sunderland came down and took these really high-class photographs for us. And these two stones in this slide are actually the oldest named stones in the graveyard. The one on they're Ogham stones. They're not in the primary locations, but the one on the left contains the name of a sept from the 5th or 6th century. So that's a long, long time ago. And the name of the sept were the Nad Segamon. A sept is like a tribe, but the historians don't like to use the word tribe in an Irish context, so we're staying with sept, S-E-P-T. Now, these Nad Segamons are believed to have been prehistoric kings of Cashel, so just before historic records started, which was around about the time of Declan or the time of Patrick. And the Nad Segamons had control, we think, of that part of South Tip and West Waterford. And it could well be the aristocratic branch of the family that St. Declan himself came from his homeland up around Cappoquin. So Nad Segamon on the left, and then the stone on the right commemorates a man called Amadou, our beloved. It's in Ogham, and it's also in Latin. So in this 5th and 6th and 7th centuries, they don't have the surnames that we have today. They didn't start forming until around the 10th and 11th, 12th centuries. But these Ogham stones are the first of the names. In 2021, Dr. Paul McCotter searched a range of medieval documents for references to Ardmore. And with the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland from 1169 onwards, Ardmore shifted from an ethnic Irish lordship to medieval Anglo-Norman control. And Ardmore Manor was established in the late 1100s, and it would appear that the Mernin family, M-E-R-N-I-N, were the first of the Norman lords of Ardmore. A search of the 1901 and the 1911 census shows some Mernin families persisting over Clashmore direction and beyond in Billierstown. And there's a lovely Mernin gravestone in Prospect Hall graveyard looking across Teal over by Ferry Point. But we have no inscribed Mernin headstones in Ardmore, even though they're believed to be in the family who built the first of the stone tower houses or the castles of Ardmore. At the same time as the Mernins, we probably had branches of the Dupuires who started as the Norman Knights of Lupware, and they are now one of the dominant surnames in the county of Waterford, not to mind in Ardmore itself. For instance, we have 20 headstones with the Power surname on in the graveyard, and 6 of them date before the 1849. In terms of the Powers, we still haven't identified, let's say, a home townland for those families. So that's one of the bits of research that we're hoping to advance. In terms of the Mernins, why don't we have stones with their names on it? If they were the top end knightly class of the 14th, 15th century, then this is the type of grave slab that we have in Ardmore. There's about 14 of these medieval grave and cross slabs in the graveyard. And we're thinking some of these, and there's 2 grave niches as well inside in the cathedral. They're probably relating to the Mernin family or relatives of theirs who invested in mortuary monuments. So there's 14 of those types of stones inside in the nave of the cathedral, and others then are dispersed out around the graveyard. This is one of them here. This is an upside down, roughly 14th century cross slab. You see, we've outlined in orange the footings of a cross, and then the shaft of a cross, and the rest of it is under the sod. So that's a body slab that would have originally rested on the ground, marking the body of a grave, and it subsequently was reused then as a grave marker, as a headstone. But they're all hiding out there for us to see. That was a wonderful surprise. When we were reading the headstones, we knew there was something funny about it. And then one morning afterwards, when the sun came out, we realised what it was, one of these 14th century cross slabs, grave slabs. This then will be the more conventional gravestones that we're looking at. And I love this photograph by John. John took the photograph of the front of the stone and then also the back of the stone. And a lot of the late 1700s gravestones in West Waterford, you can go all over the gravestones from here all the way to Kilgobnet and up to Motel into Mid Waterford and Clonea Power. And a lot of them are inscribed on the back. They'll have these cross designs on the back. Go over to Clashmore, go over to Aglish, they're all there. So it's a local style. And this photograph, I love it too, because it's 1780s and it's for an Edmund Fowlou, which is that the Irish pronunciation for Foley. And so the O'Fowlous or the Foleys are definitely contenders for being one of the longest running families in the parish of Ardmore. And this headstone takes us back nearly 275 years. Foleys are on 28 different headstones in the graveyard, and we have 8 different townlands on the gravestones associated with them. If we look at those different families like Foleys, Whelans, Phelans, Powers, they're all contenders for these older surnames of the locality, but they don't really appear a huge amount in the historic documents of the 1600s. Paul McCotter looked at a range of those documents from the 1590s onwards, when the Earl of Cork really kind of put his heel on top of this part of West Waterford. And he brought in new English tenants who were represented by surnames such as Cock and Brailsford, and these can presumably match back to English localities associated with Boyle, but we need to do research on that. Otherwise, the main Irish surnames that are in the documents of the time are Fitzgerald, Flynn, O'Hernan. I'm not sure about that surname. Could it be linked to Hurton, O'Hay or O'Haley? And also the local naming convention whereby John, the son of Daniel, for example, is evident with James MacMorrish. So James, the son of Morrish. But they don't tell us what the surname is for that particular relationship, for that particular family over in Crochet. But the warfare of the 1600s resulted in a lot of legal historic documents, and we do have a range of names there. I do remember, all right now, they're not here, but we got a rake of Mansfields in some of these documents as well, and we'll see Mansfields on the gravestones now as well later. So if we're trying to go from the gravestones and then go into the written documents and the fraught times of the penal laws, really rough with the penal times from 1680 to about 1700. But but from about 1700s, let's say 1714, 1715, the Catholic priests were allowed, if they took an oath of allegiance, I presume to the crown, then they were allowed to openly practice their religion. And the names that we have for priests of the time for Ardmore is Richard Power, a Romish priest of the parishes of Ardmore, Liskennin and Kinselabeg. So the Powers, in that period, you had to be high status to become a priest, or that's my understanding, but anyway. And after Father Power, we then had a Father Morgan Sheehy, who then took over in Ardmore and Kinselabeg. So we've got Sheehy and Power there on written documents from 1714. But another source that I think has got a lot of potential for us in Ardmore is actually to look at the names that are on the gravestones over on the Bannockon. The closer you could get to the altar, in the eastern altar in the church, the more likely you were to go to heaven in the Catholic tradition. And then if there was a saint's grave in the graveyard, then the closer you could be buried to that then was a sign of status. There was probably extra costs being buried over there. So when we look at gravestones from 1700 to 1820, all around the Bannockon, then what we're seeing the families who aren't on the written documents but are on the gravestones. And it's Foleys, Fowlus, Powers, Whelans, Whalans, Morrisseys, spelt in a range of different ways. And then Mansfields, Rooneys, O'Neills, Keens, Canes, Keankne, the same thing. Troyes. I love Hankerkin, so that's the way it's spelt on the stone, but it's a phonetic really, isn't it? It's so Hannigan, Hankerkin, Flynn, Fling, Baron. A bit further afield we have Wins and Flynn's, Fling. I think this is the first picture really of who we're seeing who are the good-sized farmers in the 1700s, and potentially are the tenant farmers who've persisted on in the locality from the Gaelic lordship. That when Tehel Connacht was pronounced by Cromwell and his subsequent successors, that a lot of families would have stayed on here as tenant farmers instead. And that's who we're trying to trace. And I'm thinking that here is where we're seeing the evidence for who they are. So when we look at all the names that are on the gravestones, then we do a frequency analysis. This is just a rough way of saying, look, what are the dominant names that are on headstones? It doesn't mean who's buried, most is buried there. What it means is who's most got their names on a gravestone. So Foley's and Fitzgerald's, Cunningham, Mansfield, Allens, Troy's, Spratt. That's everything now. That's 20th century, 19th century, 18th century. So it's just the broad brushstrokes of who we are. And the I think just before the Munster plantation, and then the arrival of the Earl of Cork and all that crowd, the Fitzgeralds were the dominant of the old Anglo-Norman families, the Old English as they were called, and they were essentially running a Gaelic lordship. And those senior families, if they wanted to hang on to their land and if they could survive the turmoil of Tudor times and Cromwellian times, then they would have had to convert to Protestantism, and they survive elsewhere up the Blackwater Valley. But the lower families, the farming families who are on the ground down here, they're very much here. So I think we can see our Fitzgeralds as one of our key links. So that would be the Anglo-Norman side, go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And then the O'Faolu, the Fuelons, the Puers going back as well. I know there's nothing unusual in that. They're all conventional West Waterford names. But when we actually quantify it, and if we can trace them to particular townlands and successions of townlands, that's where the real value will come out of this study. So if we go up to the new ground instead and then look at the names that are on the gravestones there, like the new ground has got a very high status Church of Ireland community up there. The Rush Perks graves there, I think, are from 1906 onwards. That's at a fantastic high status. The Beresford Puers, who were the Earls of Waterford, linked over to Clonea Power and over into Corrimore. For some reason, branches of them were buried over here. Fascinating groups of people. But then in the 20th century, every family in Ardmore who could afford a gravestone got a gravestone, and it was a far more democratic era. And we're seeing the kind of the smaller size farmers now appearing on gravestones here on this map of. So these are. We're seeing the medium-sized farmers and the small farmers now appearing on gravestones. Does that mean they weren't there back in the time of the Munster plantation? Maybe landlords would have brought in lots of tenants. They would have shuffled tenants around their properties. But could some of them have been here a long time? Yes, they could. And now we need to get facts for actually supporting that hypothesis and for testing it. So the major crisis of the Munster plantations and the major crisis of the Confederate Wars and the Cromwellian Wars and so on affected communities all over Ireland. And the next major crisis then after that, what happened was, despite those wars, actually the native population, or let's say the Catholic rural population, just skyrocketed from about 1700 onwards. By 1800, there was 6 million population in Ireland. The majority of them were lower class, Catholic, labouring class, and they brought a major political heft with them because there was huge amount of agrarian unrest, nighttime attacks and burnings and slaughters and all sorts of things going on. But that all came to an end with the time of the famine then. And when we actually look at the families who were here, now, we must think that when we trace them on the valuations, that a lot of the families who are here today are also on Griffith's valuation from the 1850s onwards. So there are families here who survived the famine, and then branches of them then who emigrated, we think, as a result of the famine. We presumed a lot of people had died, but the one actual bit of stats we have for the deaths during the famine, we found in this document, which records burials in Ardmore from 1847 to 1848 out of a temporary fever hospital. And it's 30 people died for that worst year of the famine. Now, that's died who wouldn't previously have died. So it's not this mass amount of death. Let's say it was 2.5 people, extra people per month, 2.7 extra people a month dying. So it's not out no crisis, but it must have been a turmoil for the families involved, and especially they would have been the lower parts of the social class. Um, so democracy was a foreign concept here in these 1840s. It was only developing, and what really worked was the rule of might. Might is right, and as the Irish Catholic population got bigger, they began to develop a might, and then but that all came to an abrupt halt with the famine. That 1 million people died throughout the country and 1 million people emigrated. Between 1845 and 1855, 1 million people were essentially economic refugees leaving this country. And that would have been branches of the family who couldn't hold on to the land, or who the landlords didn't want. And the people who did stay then, before the famine, from about 1790 until about 1830, if you had land that was worth more than 40 shillings, then you had voting rights. And so a lot of the Irish small Catholic farmers had that kind of property, and they had voting rights. So they had an element of self-determination. Didn't do them any good. The active union still happened. And then when it looks like things might actually improve, with Catholic emancipation in 1829, they did a debate and switch. Protestant ascendancy did at the time, and they said, "Oh yeah, we'll give you the vote if you want, but actually, or sorry, we'll give you emancipation for freedom of religious practice." But they changed the levels for voting rights, so it went from a £2 level to a £10 level to an English rate, and so a lot of the voting Catholic, rural Catholic, were now disenfranchised. They didn't have a vote anymore. So times were rough in those. You talk about the different Christian faiths were basically a constant conflict with one another and arm wrestles, and they had to cooperate and they had to collaborate, but they were also in major competition and a major conflict. And the politics of that change from votes, it must have had an impact in terms of how the famine was handled from 1845 onwards. And because it was handled by a series of blunders, also in a global context, you have to look at it that way as well, and see what the different responses were. But I think I'd be happy to say it was a series of blunders which resulted in major changes in landholding afterwards. And what happened was the English government, or the British government, allowed Irish small farmers to begin to buy their own land, and there was a major revolution which we benefited from ever since. And so for a long time, for 200-300 years, we would have had small farmers who were tenant farmers to landlords, Protestant ascendancy, and before them tenant farmers essentially to the elite of the Gaelic lordship. But then from about 1880 onwards, the local Ardmore families started to buy their own fields and buy their own lands, and it was a major revolution. And at the same time then, what we're seeing is that the families began to put up their headstones and began to they continue to represent their status within their community by their let's say potentially the gravestone mirroring the farm back at home. And then when we look at all the surnames, I think it's 128 surnames that we have in Ardmore, because it became a kind of a villa location for a lot of the ascendancy and a lot of the Protestant side of things. We've got a lot of Protestant names there, and some of the old Irish are kind of surviving into that. And then most of them then will be kind of the smaller farmers and the medium-sized farmers who are still working in Ardmore today. And so it's an interesting range, about 120. You'll often see that in Irish graveyards, maybe about 100 different unique surnames in a graveyard. But that might be with only 150 or 200 headstones. We've got almost 3 times that in Ardmore, and 128. But that's a different collection of names than you'll get inside in Dungarvan or in Youghal or up to Cork or all over the country. So the surnames become a sort of a fingerprint for who's living in a particular community. So with Ardmore Tidy Towns, as I wrap up now, as our partners, we're now aiming to publish a gravestone book later this year, and we're looking for the community to help us to identify the townland for each of the families listed in the gravestones. And then by Christmas, we're going to publish the catalogue of the gravestones in the graveyard with the full inscriptions and the dates that we've gleaned off those, and then a small bit of text relating to the iconography on the stones and, let's say, the financial information we can glean about the farms and so on. So on Monday night, thanks for everybody who turned out. Thanks to Aidan and Trish for hosting us, and for everybody who offered help afterwards and who shared stories of funerals and wakes and burials and so on. We aim to record a few local histories in the coming 2 months, and then after that we'll get the book out. Once we have more data added, in the next few months we'll upload all this data to Historic Graves, where it'll be freely available, and then we'll publish the catalogue before Christmas. The final thing I want to show is we're going to put out the pop-up heritage trail in the next week or so, and that's you can, if you pause the video here, and you can download the digital versions of the trails onto your phone by using those QR codes. So keep an eye out for those in the coming days, and we're open to any stories by one and all. So this has been a traverse through the way we're thinking. We're still working it out as we go along. Ardmore is our laboratory, and it's a fantastic place because the community have got a very strong pride of place, and we want to build on that and see, also then apply that to the more academic side of things and see, can we make this case? Can we prove our hypothesis that we can link all the way back into the Gaelic lordships by using gravestones alone? All right, Líg me ann mar sin. This talk has been presented as part of Heritage Week 2025, and we'll talk to you again soon. Slán